Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Multhrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. And it's my pleasure to introduce our forum today, a conversation on the complexities of hate with Ryan Lenz, Senior Investigative Reporter for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, and Antony McAleer, a former neo-Nazi and co-founder of Life After Hate. Last August, after the horrific events that unfolded in Charlottesville, Virginia, the City Club convened a forum on white supremacist domestic terrorism. We hosted it at the Happy Dog. And one of the main questions that was asked there and remained unanswered was just how significant and prevalent hate groups are in the United States. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, since 2014, the number of hate groups has increased 20%. Currently, there are active hate groups operating in all 50 states, 954 in total. And that's a troubling statistic, especially considering the Census Bureau predicts the U.S. will become a majority-minority nation by 2044. While these numbers seem troubling, and perhaps we do have reason to worry, it's important to keep in mind that hate among members of any community is not really a new phenomenon. It's actually as old as civilization itself. Human beings have the capacity to hate. However, what's different about hate in modern societies is its speed and the widespread use of communications tools and technologies that spread hateful messages quicker than ever before. So how has hate and how have hate groups changed through the decades? And what draws people to them? And as the demographics of our country change, will the way we hate change as well? Perhaps more importantly, can we ever live in a country without hate? The gentlemen on stage each come with unique insights into this topic. Ryan Lenz, as I said, is with the Southern Poverty Law Center as a senior writer for its Intelligence Project. He's also editor of the Hate Watch blog. Before joining the center in 2010, Mr. Lenz was a regional reporter for the Associated Press and a correspondent in the Iraq War for the Wire Service from 2005 to 2008. He's a graduate of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Antony McAleer is a former organizer of the White Aryan Resistance. He served as a skinhead recruiter, proprietor of Canadian Liberty Net, a computer-operated voice messaging center, and manager of the racist rock band Odin's Law. Mr. McAleer was eventually found to have contravened Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act that prohibits the dissemination of messages likely to expose groups to hatred by telephone. In 2011, he co-founded the nonprofit Life After Hate, which works with individuals looking to leave a life of hate and violence and assists organizations grappling with the causes of intolerance and racism. He travels around the world using his story to combat racism and extremist views. Here to steward our conversation is IdeaStream reporter and producer Darielle Snipes. She's no stranger to our stage. She's an award-winning journalist who has worked in Oklahoma City, Baltimore, Detroit, and Indianapolis before coming to Cleveland. Currently, she has returned to daily television as a reporter for Ideas on WVIZ PBS. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Ryan Lenz, Tony McAleer, and Darielle Snipes.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome, gentlemen. Welcome to Cleveland.
Thank you for having us.
So I just wanted to start, Ryan, I wanted to start with you. I mean, you've done extensive reporting around the world and have seen hate on different levels in different countries. Is it different in different countries as it is, say, here, as it is right now?
Well, that's a very good question because a lot of people want to talk about what's happening in the United States right now, especially post-2016 election, as if it's an anomaly, as if it's a unique reality to America, or at least the latest iteration of historic hate and extremism. But what's happening in the United States right now is actually part of, I would argue, like a global puzzle, a quiltwork of hate and extremism, that's happening everywhere. Germany, Italy, France, Poland, Hungary, these countries are all swelling with the same sorts of sentiments and racist sentiments, extremist ideas that we're seeing in America right now.
And Tony, obviously you're from Canada, so I mean there's hate in Canada. I mean it's all over the world, not just here in America.
Yeah, I mean, despite what everybody thinks about Canada, it is a nice place to live, but we don't have the same political problems as here, but we have proportionally the same number of hate groups per capita in Canada as there is in the United States.
And Ryan, you never thought that we would be where we are here today, did you?
No, so when I started with the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2010, it was a fascinating job covering what very much seemed to be at the time, a fringe reality of American life. The Klan, the neo-Nazi organizations that were ever present but always on the fringe. And in the 8 years that I've covered this movement, we've seen it, as people say, move from the margins to the mainstream. There's not a day that passes where you don't read a story in the newspaper about, some swastika being drawn on a synagogue or a hate crime existing here. And that's just sort of the surface level reality. We see college campuses, erupt in violence with hate groups and student organizations that are white nationalist in identity, pushing these ideas on a scale that I don't think I ever anticipated.
And so, as Dan said, hate is not new. It's happened since the beginning of time. So what has changed? Why is it that we're seeing more hate groups being formed, more people joining hate groups, more vocal now more than ever? Well,
I mean, on a sociological level, it has a lot to do with what was said in the introduction about the very real prediction that the racial demographics of America will change in the coming decades. But we can't discount the role the internet has played in sort of propagating or spreading these ideas. 2018, the internet is a much more intimate reality in our lives than it was even, say, in 2015. There's not a moment that passes where we sit at the table and have a conversation without a phone in our hand. And that has been a very effective tool to spread the ideas of hate and extremism on a mass level without the hindrances of recruitment that has troubled hate groups in the past.
Mm-hmm. And Tony, you were with a hate group in Canada. Just can you talk about your story and why you joined it, and how it's changed the recruitment today?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a middle class family. My father was a psychiatrist. I could probably blame it on that, but I walked in on my father when I was 10 with another woman, and I got rocked by that, and I developed I felt betrayed by the authority figures in my life. And I went to school, my grades started sliding, and I went to an all-boys Catholic school, and they decided that they were going to beat the grades back into me. And that sent me off a path where I found the skinhead youth subculture, because I was really, really angry. And I don't ever blame anything that I did on my childhood. I chose to do everything that I did. I want to be very clear about that. But through the lens of those events, I made choices. Have you ever been to the grocery store when you're really hungry? Mm-hmm. You know how you make different choices? And I like to say I went out into the world emotionally hungry, and I made the equivalent of junk food choices and hurt a lot of people. But it wasn't so much the ideology that drew me there, though. It was, I got a sense of power when I felt powerless. I got a sense of acceptance when I felt unlovable. I got a sense of attention when I felt invisible. And it's those deeper psychological drivers is what draws people, that creates the vulnerabilities that allow people to be drawn in and seduced by the ideology.
Then how did you feed into the hate? Or you said when we were speaking on the phone that they don't talk about the ideology in the beginning. They play to your vulnerabilities. And so how did they make the switch from your vulnerabilities to the ideology, and how did you buy into it?
Well, they offer you friendship, camaraderie, all of those things at first. They put your arm around you, have a beer, come to this concert with us. That was back in the day. And then they feed the ideology to you more and more and more, and it's easy to blame others, right? And when your life is not going that great, we look for why is it not going that great, and somebody comes along and tells you it's their fault, it's the Jews, it's immigrants, it's whatever, and it feeds that narrative, and it makes sense of the chaos in one's own life, and it did for me. And there's a whole generation of young men that think this, and they haven't grown up yet, because when you grow up, you don't blame others, you take responsibility for yourself. And these are young men confused, trying to search for answers about masculinity, about race, about everything, and they're just so easy to exploit in that way.
In the intro, Dan talked about it, the minorities will be a majority in a couple of decades. Do you feel that white men in particular are afraid about that, and that's why they want to join these hate groups?
I think it's certainly a part of it. I think there's certainly a loss of status that has happened and is happening. And Princeton's done a couple of interesting studies on suicide by despair, right? And the lifespan of white males is actually decreasing because of the epidemic of suicide, opiates. If you look at the gun death statistics for white men or white people in general, it's suicide. It's not homicide. And so there's something happening there. There's some sort of distress happening that is, again, easy for someone to come along and say, you know why? You know why you don't have the job, or you know why? It's that person over there. And that it's the sort of the feeling, the grievance is very real with these people. The conclusions that they jump to, the conclusions that they're led to, are complete baloney. But there is something there that I think we need to look at, to address at the source.
I mean, there's most definitely a crisis of sorts regarding in young white masculine identity, and how it is being exploited or manipulated, or how it's falling victim to these ideologies. I mean, for the first time this year, the SPLC listed men's rights groups as hate groups. This was Elliot Rogers in San Bernardino, who went on that shooting spree. He was a member of the so-called incel rebellion, which are involuntarily celibate young men who claim that they are victims of a culture that doesn't respect them anymore. And you see this across the country, nationwide, in universities, where young white men are feeling that as especially in the last 8 years of the Obama administration, as multicultural, progressive initiatives were gaining traction, they didn't see this as sort of greater equality. They saw this as a lessening of their own social status. And so in many ways, this is a reaction, a misguided reaction, and an exploited reaction to advancements to a progressive cause.
And so you bring up President Obama. Many people, when he was elected, jumped for joy, said, "Oh, racism is over. Everything's going to be great. We're all going to get along. We have our first black president." And it was quite the opposite that's happened.
Absolutely. Like the punditry after President Obama's election, it was just this outcrying of we finally, and they asked it as a question, do we finally live in a post-racial America? Does race no longer matter now that we've elected our first African-American president? And within 2 years, the indications were in that we did not. Hate groups by 2012, by 2010 and 11 had risen to all-time highs of near over 1,200, which was just staggering and frightening. And I think at the end of the Obama administration, with the rise of populist ethno-nationalism, the answer to that question is we do not live in a post-racial America. The waters of racial resentment run very deep in this country, and we have fundamental questions about who and what is an American that we have struggled to answer since the country's founding, that we're struggling with even now.
And so white supremacist groups have always been here. And even when they were quiet, they weren't as vocal. What sparked them to come and feel more comfortable just saying, speak hate?
I don't, that's a really good question, and I couldn't tell you why they felt more comfortable coming into the mainstream, but they did. And there's a story, an anecdote that I'm going to tell about what happened here in Cleveland with the Republican National Convention. The 2016 presidential campaign did quite a lot to make hate groups and extremists feel comfortable coming out in the open. They felt that finally, with President Trump's campaign, which blew dog whistles across the board to racist hate groups, they felt that, oh wow, okay, finally we have a politician who's willing to listen to us that we've not seen in decades. So at the Republican National Convention here in Cleveland, Richard Spencer, who runs a hate group called the National Policy Institute, he was also the guy who led that rally in Washington where all those racists threw up the Sieg Heils after President Trump was elected. He stood outside the convention with a placard that's a poster board on which he had written, want to talk to a racist, and the word racist was in single quotes. And this was a man who was unashamed of his viewpoints, who was proud of his viewpoints and proud of his white pride, and he was willing to engage, come what may the consequence. He was rich, educated, and so he wouldn't suffer, the problems of some sort of, a social consequence, or even if he lost his job, if he had one, it wouldn't matter, because he didn't have the typical things that would be a detriment to people whose identity as a racist came out. So with Spencer, he comes out, he's dapper, he's dressed to the nines, and he doesn't look like like a Nazi with an armband or facial tattoos. He looks like a respected, educated intellectual, and he is. But he's also a racist. And so with Spencer, we see a whole cadre of young racists who've come up and said, listen, I'm going to dress up, I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to have fine meals, and I'm going to be unashamed of being white, and I'm going to preach to the high heavens all the hate I know.
Do you think President Donald Trump has fed into that as well with his Make America Great Again?
I don't know about if the Make America Great Again has been the message that's so much pushed it, but definitely post-Charlottesville, when President Trump gets up and says, there's bad people on both sides, that unnecessary and I think wrong-headed equation of racist extremism with that which seeks to fight it has done a lot to mainstream these ideas.
And you touched upon the online and the chatter, just with the recruitment. They feel that they can get online, whether they're in Idaho. They can talk to someone in California and have the same views, Tony. I mean, and this is how they're really growing and how they're able to get to feel that they're accepted, would you say?
Yeah, so there's really sort of two different populations here. There's the traditional physical organizations, the National Socialist Movement and all that you see at rallies. There's a whole, it's almost like the tip of the iceberg. There's a much larger mass of people online that are congregating in chat rooms and 4chan and stuff like that, and it seems to me that there seems to be a high level of correlation with mild spectrum autism. They refer to themselves as autists, weaponized autism, waging war against the normies. That's sort of how they've positioned themselves. And so there's kind of two different worlds. And I think in Charlottesville was the first time they really came together to manifest in the real world all at once. When I joined the movement, you had to mail away to somebody, and you'd order books, and you'd wait a month to get it, and But now with the internet, it would take months and years to radicalize at the rate you could get the information. Now on the internet, it's weeks and months, because you can binge watch an ideology, and that's the difference. You can get the whole thing, downloaded in your computer, and you binge watch an ideology, and that's what I think is somewhat dangerous. And the ability of these people who may have been isolated at school, because of their social awkwardness of having mild spectrum autism or whatever, they can now all congregate together. They're not a loner. There's a million of them. And after Charlottesville, we received a letter from a mother who said, my son's 18, he's got Asperger's syndrome, and he's found this white nationalist community online, and I'm really, really terrified. She says, what terrifies me the most is that community has accepted and embraced my son in a way that nobody else has in his entire life. And those are the deep psychological drivers we have to deal with. That kid would believe the earth is flat in order to get that acceptance and belonging that at a deep level he craves.
So do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better, gentlemen?
It's hard to...
That's really, I mean, that's really hard to say. I mean, but let me say this, what is worse, more racists or more violence at the hands of racists, I don't see anything really slowing the stream of recruitment. There are, if you look at Twitter, Facebook, and other social media outlets, they're struggling to sort of marry up their cause with their devotion to free speech with the reality that speech has consequence. And so there's that dilemma happening in the online space. In the real world, we've got groups that have become mainstream political entities like the National Policy Institute, but we also have, for the first time, at least cellular groups like Atomwaffen, which stands for Atomic War, which is this cellular structured organization across the country that is actively training for race war. And they post videos on these weird dark corners of the internet of them out there, training paramilitary style, and they're young white men. And these groups, they're responsible for killing 5 people already, and they're growing. So there's that which law enforcement is trying to infiltrate, the online sphere where people are trying to tackle this, and we've got the reality that this is all becoming mainstreamed politically. So I think I don't want to be caustic and say, oh, it's bound to get worse, but it does seem like there are some major hurdles that have to be overcome before there's going to be any effort in pulling this back.
But Tony, your organization, Life After Hate, was working to get some type of computer program installed, especially working with Twitter, to try to reduce the amount of hate speech. So that's somewhat of a solution that could happen so that the hate speech won't be spread online.
Right. So if you go to wecounterhate.com is the name of the site, and a creative agency called Possible out of Seattle approached us wanting to do something, and we sent a team to Seattle to help. They work with AI and machine learning, so we helped teach the machine phrases, code words, symbols that show up in hate speech, and we sort of identified 6 levels of hate speech. And what the AI does is when a Twitter thing comes in at online, and it's also by a social influencer, not just some guy by himself in his basement, it flags it. It goes to a human being who then reviews it, and that's part of the machine learning process. And then when it goes, yep, that's hate speech, and we're talking about the most egregious hate speech, it says this message, it replies to the message and says this message has been countered. Because it has been deemed to be hate speech. If you want to retweet this message, we're going to give a donation to Life After Hate. And what that has done is created a 70% reduction in the retweets of targeted speech, and a 20% of the time the author self-deletes his own message. Right. And it's without using censorship, right? We're exercising free speech too, and so it's an innovative way. And I think the people are coming up with different innovations using technology that we can counter this stuff. So as it's growing, so is the response to it. So it's not hopeless. I think there's a lot of people that have given up hope, and it is far from hopeless. I do fear the emergence of these, they're more like the Parkland shooting, these school shootings with isolated individuals, and it's becoming normalized almost as an expression of impotent rage. And I think I fear for the normalization of that and the emergence of those acts of mass killing, which are not necessarily done by organized groups, but emerging individuals doing that, maybe inspired by those groups.
Two things I want to mention off that. Like the normalization of hate-driven violence is just alarming. 5 years ago when there would be a mass shooting, we would scour our databases, scour our files to see if there was any sort of tie-in between this guy, whoever went on the shooting once his name was released, and any hate group we knew. And if there was, news reporters from across the world would just call, and it would be days of telephone calls of like, who is this guy? Who is this group? What is their idea? What's their ideology? And now, in 2017, I believe there were more mass shootings than days. And the trend seems to be continuing in 2018, and nobody calls anymore, really, partially because everybody's covering it pretty well, like trying to find out where, how this ties into whatever element of extremism. But also, it's sort of a given, It's like if someone goes off on a shooting, well, something's wrong, and then we're surprised when it's just sort of like a dispute. More often than not, there's some tie-in to some extremist and radical idea that has become, like I said earlier, there's not a day that goes by where we don't read about Nazis in the newspaper.
Well, let's talk about compassion and how it needs to weave into the life to life right now, especially for all the groups. I mean, you guys, both of you, feel that compassion needs to happen for neo-Nazis or white supremacists and for minorities. Would you say?
Absolutely. I think to expand beyond compassion, I think what is needed now more than ever is hope. And I find it really interesting because, President Obama, when he campaigned in 2008, his message was hope. And whether you agree with him politically or not, that's aside the point. At this point in time, I think it's so fascinating to me that 8 years later, the country that was so compelled forward with this notion of hope for something better is so distant to that concept. We can't even conceive of it, And let me, I used to work in Montgomery, Alabama in our headquarters, and I've moved to Atlanta since, but every day I would come to work, right? And right outside the window of my desk, I could stand up and I'd look down on it. And it was Martin Luther King's first church. I mean, and it was just sitting there, and it became sort of this daily just thing. It was just that it was Dexter Memorial Baptist Church. I'm like, of course, but in the years, in the year leading up to 2016, like you'd look down at that building and you'd say, like this is nothing new. This fight that we're having right now, this struggle has existed, since the beginning of this country, and it is as important now as it was when the civil rights movement was existing in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. And so I think that along with hope, with hope comes compassion, because if you can actually manifest hope in your heart, you look to someone with a different set of eyes, and you can look to them and you can say, listen, like I know we're not going to see eye to eye. You've got ideas that I find abhorrent, like disgusting. But if this is to happen, if this country is to progress, you and I have got to talk, because I have got to pull you back from the edge. So.
In the work that we do in our outreach program, Exit USA, we're dealing with these people all the time, and what we have to remember, and we know this through our own experience, because all of the co-founders of Life After Hate used to be in that world as members or leaders, is that no one is irredeemable.
All right.
And we find, we took someone that was a veteran, extremely Islamophobic, and was actually thinking about doing some harm to the local Muslim center. And we sent a couple guys went up there to talk with him, and we took him for a meeting with the local imam. And he said, well, okay, I've got 15 minutes for you. 2.5 hours later, they were hugging it out, and it was the beginning of a remarkable friendship between those two. And I can't tell you how powerful and healing receiving compassion, particularly receiving compassion from someone who we don't feel we deserve it from someone we had dehumanized. I just want to make clear, it is not the responsibility of people of color to go hug a Nazi or do compassion. It's a wonderful gift if you choose to do that. But the power of compassion to transform. And I think, and research shows this, shame is at the source of a lot of this, and compassion is the antidote to shame. And it's up to us I don't think there's any grand piece of legislation that's going to be signed, or a politician coming in on a big white horse to save us from all of this. I think it's up to us as individuals in every moment and every action of every day to try and bring compassion into it, with our neighbors, with everybody. It's contagious. And I think we have to look at how can I be more compassionate in my daily life, and start with it's millions of little acts that are going to make the difference, and it's being conscious of every little thing that we do that is going to make the difference. And if we sit and wait for somebody else to fix it, it's not going to get fixed.
Well said.
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm Darielle Snipes, reporter producer for IdeaStream, and today we are enjoying a forum of the Complexities of Hate with Ryan Lenz, senior investigative reporter for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, and Antony McAleer, a former neo-Nazi and co-founder of Life After Hate. And we may have our first question.
Mr. Lenz,
Yes.
In tracking hate groups, what are the criteria that the SPLC uses to define what is a hate group and is needed tracking?
A hate group, we get this question a lot, and there seems to be a lot of confusion about it, but it's quite simple. A hate group is an organization that defames, denigrates, demonizes, or vilifies a class of people based on an immutable characteristic, something they can't change. It's as simple as that. A lot of people say that it's politically motivated, or that we list conservative organizations, but it has absolutely nothing to do with that. It is solely about protected classes of people and the attacks on them.
I was raised in Germany under the Nazi regime, and I saw hate groups or persons who hate start before Hitler as fringe groups, as small hate groups, cells, and almost overnight, hate became respectable. It was carried out by merchants, family people, perfectly respectable people whose views and attitudes changed overnight until in the 30s, late 30s, the norm was to be a hater. How do you prevent hate from becoming infectious? And in Germany, it took a transformative leader, as we all know. Can the same happen over here? How can we keep from spreading the disease?
I got an idea.
Yeah, again, I think, and I'm not a World War II or Weimar Republic expert, but I think I always come back to shame. And with the humiliation of Germany after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, you had a nation shamed, and I think that set the vulnerability for someone to rescue them from that humiliation. And it becomes very palatable to get rid of that shame, even if it's to go towards a shameful thing. I think that is certainly an ingredient of it.
After the election, on the morning following the election, we were inundated with phone calls and email reports of what we called bias incidents, because hate crime is a legal designation. We were just inundated. Stories of Muslim women having their hijabs ripped off on subway platforms, swastikas being drawn on cars, vile racial epithets being spray painted on synagogues, and it was overnight. We had never seen anything like this before. We in the first 10 days after the election, there were over 1,000 of these incidents in the country, and people had never told us of this before. And we've seen it since continue to grow, especially as politicians, not just the president, but politicians, speak using rhetoric that is callous to racial identity, and normalizing violence against various racial and ethnic groups. So I think the answer, as you said, a transformative leader in Germany was responsible for changing, how normalized hate and extremism had been. And as we see these ideas be embraced by mainstream politicians, whether they be fringe conspiracy theories like Agenda 21, or wild ideas about immigrants bringing in diseases, until there's a political sea change where lies are no longer portrayed as facts, I think we're going to see an increase in sort of this realization. There are a lot of historians and academics who are drawing parallels to the rise in autocratic fascism in Germany to this moment in American history too. Now, I'm not about to predict that we're on the road to becoming Germany circa 1937 or whatever, but I do think that there are direct parallels to to the age of the strong man and autocratic governments and what we're seeing regarding this. So I think it's going to be a political solution in some ways.
I'd also like to add, and to quote Mark Twain, or paraphrase Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure seems to rhyme a lot.
Yeah, right.
But I think, we all have a role as bystanders.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be courageous in how we stand up to it. Now, we have to be aware of our safety, because sometimes it's very dangerous on how you act as a bystander. But I remember the week after Charlottesville, I was at Boston Common, and there was a rally of 30 people in the middle of Boston Common. There was 40,000 people came out to say, "Not in my town." And I think we, in our response to that, we need to act properly as bystanders, and we also need to take action to ensure that the people that are the targets feel safe and secure, and that they're not alone. And I think that's an important actions that we all need to do.
Yes, you are going to hold it. Right. You told me that. You talked a little bit about whether or not just now policy can be the source of change, the change of heart that actually needs to come. And you also mentioned that compassion is the antidote to shame and the consequences of shame that come politically, economically, and socially. I wondered what the antidote to prejudice was.
I think, I mean, that's a question that people have tried to answer forever, Okay, well, I mean, okay, well, let me give it a shot. Let me see if I can solve this. Now, I think that I don't think it's a single answer. I think it's a system of responses, or like a connection, a mosaic of ideas. There's a lot to be said for proximity theory at the SPLC. Our teaching tolerance program. Has these things like Mix It Up Day and reaches into children, into schools, because a lot of times hate is not innate; it's learned, or it's experienced as a solution to, as Tony said, shame. It's like, this is how I deal with what's bothering me. But I think at the end of the day, there is something to definitely be said for proximity, for this sort of proximity learning and proximity education to reach children early on. And I'll bring this up as a point too, because we're finding in this Trump era, this is not just an adult issue, It's happening in schools, and it's terrifying what's happening in schools. We did a report where students are actually, like one school, I think it was in Texas, some immigrant kids came in to find the students had built a wall with cardboard boxes telling them to get out. This is in the 6th grade. So education is very important. Policy is very important. Advancements and recognitions of online problems are very important. And that's what I mean when I say I think it's the answer to prejudice is multifold. I'll also say this, that prejudice is innate in human beings. We all had and I think in order to address prejudice, we must recognize that we have it. That we have, inner bias, that everybody has perspective-driven realities that they see that put someone lower than them. It's human nature, but we are smart enough and I think conscientious enough to move beyond it, so long as we address it and recognize it exists.
I think, this is my personal belief, the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is actually a mirror reflection of how internally disconnected and dehumanized we are. And I think schools, if we look at it as some places look at violence as a health issue and treating it as if it's a medical issue, I think schools are ground zero to dealing with this issue. Shame is interesting because the research says that the most common correlated factor in the history of personal history of someone joining a violent extremist group is childhood trauma, right? But it's a lousy predictor. Because you have childhood trauma, it doesn't mean you're going to go join a violent extremist group. Shame and unresolved anger always expresses itself as violence. And I chose an ideology which gave me permission to do the violence to other people, and gave me permission and an intellectual framework to justify it. But more often than not, that violence is done to the self, and it's addiction, it's cutting, it's all kinds of behaviors, all the way down the road to suicide. So dealing with issues around shame with young people in schools, shame is responsible for a whole spectrum of antisocial outcomes, of which racism and prejudice is here. There's a whole spectrum that all cost society, And I think if we learn to work with children better and to better navigate and process different things and how to be human with each other, because we all have another, right? You know, think about who your other is. But I think the school is the place that we really need to focus and make those changes. Orange County Mayor, I think he has a program called A Million Acts of Kindness, and already it's dropped bullying in the Orange County schools by 50% and is correlated with other social benefits in society. So we need to rethink of what we teach kids and to teach them how to be better to each other.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you both for joining us, and Danielle for doing such a great job. My question is for Mr. McAleer. Can you speak in a bit more detail about your specific situation? Was there an occurrence, an event that led you to make the 180? I'd like to hear about that. And secondly, do you think that speaking to individuals is the right way to make these kinds of changes, very similar to the example you gave with the veteran and the Muslim leader?
I'll answer that last bit first. It's not the total solution, it's just a part of the solution. We're doing what we can to be part of the solution. We don't have 100% of the answer. We're only a small NGO. But for me, it was the day I was in a delivery room, and I have this beautiful little baby girl in my hands that hasn't opened her eyes yet, and she's got this little scrunchy face, and she opens her eyes, and my face is the first picture her brain's going to take. And I connected to another human being for the first time since I couldn't remember when. Because the reason we become disconnected, and I was completely disconnected, operating from ego. I was a total narcissist. I was an attention whore, all of that. But I'd shut off, right? And the reason we become this, the reason I became a skinhead, because I made me feel safe. I hung out with very violent, tough people because I wasn't tough, right? And people feared me when I was with them. That was how I got a sense of safety out of it. And we cut off our feelings because it's too painful to stay open, you know. And I think it's part of the human experience. It's not unique to me, and we make different choices based on that. But that started a thawing process. It wasn't a magic moment. It wasn't like that. But it started a thawing process. And what's amazing about kids, and these stories of birth of a child show up over and over and over again amongst the stories of formers. And anecdotally, I'm going to say it's mostly a female child. I think there's something about the feminine energy being introduced into that hypermasculine space that's transformative, but they're safe to love. And I could start to allow myself to open up. And I had a son 15 months later, because they're safe to love. They're not capable of shaming. They're not capable of ridicule. They're not capable of rejection until they're about 13. But it allowed me to open up and be vulnerable. And you know, they don't see the monster that we see when we look in the mirror, right? They just saw this great dad, and that's compassion, right? They have that compassion. And my mom, I ended up being a single father when they were 4 and 6, and raised the 2 children myself. I have a total respect to all women that, single parent or not, that have made that journey, because I got treated like a hero and a pat on the back for being a single dad, and I know that doesn't happen for women. But you know, and she never gave up on me. She always saw little Tony, who I was when I was 4 and 5. But her relationship with me was very conditional. And I think compassion, where it often gets the notion that it may be weak, right? And it has to be accompanied with healthy boundaries and consequences. Our executive director has got a simple way of saying it: never condemn, never concede when we're dealing with a former. But she said, if you want my help raising those children, you got to get out of that stuff. And it was, as I started to realize that what I was doing was affecting my ability to provide for my family, and my family became more important. And the other piece to that is I started to get attention, acceptance, approval, all of those things in a healthy way, being a single father. So it was easy for me, I wouldn't say it was easy, but I replaced those needs with getting those met in a healthier way. And the third piece of compassion is I started as a financial advisor in 2004, and I still one today. And I started going to these personal growth and development workshops to get out of my own way, get out of the ego and law of attraction, Tony Robbins kind of stuff. And the guy who did these workshops, he was about 10 years older. He's from Manchester. I was originally born in Liverpool, and we bonded over Monty Python and quirky English things. And I did these programs for about 8 months, did all his workshops, and we got to know each other pretty well, and we became good friends. And I started to notice my life improving. And 8 months later, the guy who had introduced us hands me an envelope for my birthday. And I go, great, I'm gonna get a gift certificate to go somewhere. And it's like, it's therapy. It's a gift certificate for therapy. Like, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want that for their birthday, right? So I go into my first ever therapy session with this guy, and I'm telling him about, why I'm mad at my dad and my mom and my childhood, and as you do in your first therapy session. And then I go, do I tell him the rest? Because for me, when people had found out about my past, that was the end of the relationship. And this was a relationship I valued greatly. And he goes, come on, mate, just let it out. You look like you're trying to swallow 3 golf balls. And so I start telling him about white Aryan resistance and neo-Nazi, skinhead, all the violence. And the more I tell him, the more he smiles. And I'm getting really annoyed. Right? I'm just like, I'm being vulnerable. It's my first therapy session, and he's laughing at me. And I get and the more I tell him, the more he smiles. And I go, what's so freaking funny? And he leans in with a big grin on his face, and he goes, you know I'm Jewish, right? And no, I didn't know, but in that moment, here's this Jewish man who I greatly respected, thought of as, as a friend, and he's still my mentor and counselor and coach today. Here he is, wants to see the best for me, wants to see me heal, wants to see me be the best version of me, and I'm shrinking in my seat because I'd once advocated for the annihilation of him and his people. But for him to have that compassion, that was so powerful, and it was 3 pieces of compassion that I point to. Dov is his name, Dov Baron, my mom, and my children, and that was how I made the journey out.
Hello, my name is Maya Finnessy, and we are from Cleveland Heights High School. Do you think in the future the hate group will stop?
No, I don't think hate groups will. I think, we advocate and we push for and we work every day for the complete destruction of organized hate in this country. And it's, every year we release a number of hate groups. Last year there were 954. But I don't think that's a complete picture of hate in America. I think it's becoming more diffused. So while hate groups might disappear, I don't think hate will go away. I want to touch back on this idea about shame. It's for a long time the tools that we would use to combat hate and extremism, especially after the passage of especially after the Civil Rights Movement. The idea was like, how can you hold these ideas? It's a shameful position to hold these ideas that there are people who are less than you. And it worked for a long time, to point out that, like to say, to a neo-Nazi or something, like, at least from my perspective, and it was one of the ways to sort of bring attention to the shame of the idea. It's a shameful thing you're doing. And then it would reflect on their own shame and what brought them into this movement. But now, in the 21st century, these white kids in colleges who are running to hate groups, they're not running because they're ashamed. They're running because they're angry they're being told they should be ashamed. They're like, no, I'm not ashamed of being white. I'm not afraid to say I'm proud of who I am. And so that's a difficult thing. Like, the tools that the left has used, the tools that, anti-racist organizations have used forever to combat this have kind of gone away. So I don't know what's next, and I don't know how to turn the tide, but I mean, I will say this: that we've seen in the recent 4 or 5 months a complete collapse of the so-called alt-right. Like, they're falling apart. It's quite amazing to watch. I mean, there's like stories of infidelity, incestuous relationships, money problems, and it's for someone like me, it's kind of delightful to see because it's falling apart. I like it very much, but I don't think the idea, hate groups will, as we know them, will go away. They may shrink and get smaller, and God willing, they will.
I just want to add in there just to distinguish between when I talk about shame. There's shame, healthy shame, which is the visceral feeling, you feel the blood come into your cheeks and stuff. I'm talking mostly about toxic shame. And there's a great book by John Bradshaw, Healing the Shame That Binds You. That's worth a read. And it's deep in the subconscious, and I call it like an impaired sense of self, and you, through your experiences as an individual, or there's a collective shame, I think, for the experiences as a group of people. It's the feeling of being less than. I'm not good enough. And it's not at a conscious level, but we live our lives in reaction to that. And one way to react to feeling less than is to be greater than, and to be an overachiever, or to have to win every negotiation and deal, or you can live up to that lie and be a gifted underachiever, or you can adopt an ideology like I did that told me that I was greater than. What's a word that's the opposite of shame?
Pride.
Right, and so it's that deeper piece that, and I think that's why the visceral shame is less and less effective, but it's still driven by that.
Absolutely.
And when we want to try and understand how this works as a group, I look at some studies done at Harvard University with African American students, and they gave the students 2 sets of identical tests, machine marked, so there was no marker bias. The only difference between the 2 tests was that one asked the student to self-identify their race, check off the box for which one that you were. And the African-American students that had to self-identify as black before they wrote that test performed much worse than the African-American students that didn't have to answer that question. And that's how deep that kind of shame goes, that it's deep and insidious, and I think we need to address that amongst all groups. It's a greater societal thing. It's not just a white thing.
I'm wondering if we could learn from people who do better at hate. For instance, do Canadians do better than Americans? And are there certain laws in Canada or media laws that help them? And the other thing I was thinking about, certain groups like Quakers during World War II were more tolerant, seem to have less hate toward the Japanese than the rest of us. Can we learn from Canadians, other democracies, or can we learn from the Quakers, for instance?
As far as Canada goes, the movement doesn't really recognize borders. So there's American groups operating in Canada full of Canadians, and vice versa. I don't know that they're any less violent. I don't necessarily think that they are. I think what is different is the gun culture is a little bit different in Canada, where the guns are a privilege, not a right, and there is no open carry anywhere. It's all very sort of restricted. And Canada does have, I think they got rid of some of them now, but they do have hate speech laws that if you incite hatred against an identifiable group, you can do up to 2 years in prison, I think. So there is restrictions that they put in place, but I'm not so sure that suppressing it makes it go away. It makes it behave differently, that's all.
Lots of European countries have different regulations. Our First Amendment is quite expansive. Many European countries don't have such an expansive, privilege of speech. As Tony says, suppression is not the answer. It's especially on this scale. But on the grounds of the First Amendment, there are lots of the EU is starting to put some restrictions on Facebook and start demanding financial restitution for Facebook being used as a propagator of hate. That's not existing in the United States. And so, there are all sorts of, all sorts of different democracies across the world are trying to address the tech question ultimately as to how this interconnected world that we live in is being exploited, or how it's aiding the propagation or the spread of these ideas. But I don't think anybody has a solid answer yet. And I would completely agree that suppression is not the answer. So.
Today at the City Club, we're enjoying a forum on the complexities of hate with Antony McAleer, former neo-Nazi, and Ryan Lenz, senior investigative reporter for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project. Tony's also, of course, co-founder of Life After Hate. Our moderator today is IdeaStream reporter and producer Darielle Snipes. Our community partner for our program today is the YWCA of Greater Cleveland, whose mission is to end racism and empower women. Our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating and for your presence here. Listening, as we are often told, is an act of love, so thank you for doing that. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.